Imagine the most powerful person in your world is dead. Not just a king, not just a ruler, a god. The man who held the sun in its orbit, who kept the Nile flooding on schedule, who stood between your civilization and the chaos waiting at its edges. He is gone. His body is still warm. And nobody told you what to do next. That was the reality for every Egyptian who lived through the death of a pharaoh. It happened dozens of times across 3,000 years of history. And what unfolded in those first hours and days after the royal death was nothing like the solemn, orderly procession you might imagine. It was panic. It was political crisis. It was the edge of collapse. The moment a pharaoh stopped breathing, the entire Egyptian concept of reality cracked open. Here is why that matters. Ancient Egyptians did not think of their pharaoh the way you think of a president or a prime minister. The pharaoh was not a man who held an office. He was the living embodiment of Horus, the falcon god of kingship and the sky. He was the link between the human world and the divine. His body was the mechanism by which the universe stayed in order. The ancient Egyptian concept of this order was called Ma'at. It meant truth, balance, cosmic harmony. Without Ma'at, the world unraveled. Without a pharaoh, Ma'at had no anchor. So, when the pharaoh died, Ma'at was technically broken. And the Egyptians knew it. Within the royal palace, the first response was not grief. It was speed. Historian Joanne Fletcher, who has spent decades studying royal Egyptian burials, notes that the court understood immediately that the gap between pharaohs, even a gap of hours, was cosmically dangerous. Priests, scribes, and officials moved fast. Very fast. Because the longer Egypt existed without a living Horus, the more vulnerable it became to Isfet, the ancient Egyptian word for chaos, disorder, the opposite of Ma'at. The heir was named immediately if one had been designated, not in a ceremony, not in a public announcement. In a quiet room, surrounded by advisors, the transfer of divine identity was declared. The new pharaoh did not need a coronation to be pharaoh. He needed only to be recognized as Horus in the moment the old Horus departed. The coronation would come later, sometimes weeks or months later, but the kingship itself transferred the instant the old man died. This was not symbolic. To the Egyptians, it was literal. The god had simply moved from one body to another. Now the old body had to be handled, and this is where it gets stranger than anything you were taught in school. The ancient Egyptians believed that the human body was not just a container for a soul, it was a permanent address. The soul, which they divided into multiple parts, including the Ka and the Ba, needed the body to return to after death. The Ka was your life force, your double, the spiritual version of you that existed alongside you your entire life. The Ba was closer to what we might call personality or individual essence. It could leave the body and travel, but it had to come back. Every single night, according to Egyptian belief, the Ba returned to the body. If the body was destroyed, your soul had nowhere to go. You ceased to exist. Not just in this life, in every life. For an ordinary Egyptian, that was terrifying enough. For a pharaoh, a god, it was unthinkable. So, what happened to the royal body within hours of death was not mourning. It was emergency preservation. Embalmers were summoned, but not just any embalmers. The lead embalmer held a specific title. He was called the Overseer of Mysteries, and he wore a mask of Anubis, the jackal-headed god of death and mummification. During the process, Egyptologist Salima Ikram, one of the world's foremost experts on ancient Egyptian mummification, has documented that the full royal mummification process took 70 days. 70. That number was not arbitrary. It corresponded to the period that the star Sirius disappeared from the Egyptian sky each year before rising again. A celestial cycle the Egyptians associated with death and rebirth. But the process began within hours. The body was washed with palm wine and rinsed with water from the Nile. The brain was removed, typically through the nostril, using a hooked instrument, and discarded. The Egyptians believed the heart was the seat of intelligence and emotion. The brain, to them, was essentially packing material. It was not preserved. The organs that mattered, the liver, lungs, stomach, and intestines, were carefully extracted, dried with a salt called natron, and placed into 4 containers called canopic jars, each protected by one of the 4 sons of Horus. The body cavity was packed with natron and left to dry for 40 days. Then it was cleaned again, wrapped in linen, and sealed with resins and amulets and prayers, 70 days. And during all 70 of those days, Egypt was in a state of mourning unlike anything you have experienced in modern life. Temples reduced their rituals, music stopped, festivals were canceled. Herodotus, the Greek historian who traveled through Egypt in the 5th century BC, recorded that during the mourning period, Egyptians abstained from wheat and wine and any food considered luxurious. They dressed simply. They did not bathe. In some accounts, they covered themselves in mud, a physical enactment of grief written onto the body. The idea was that the entire civilization shared the wound. If the pharaoh was the embodiment of Egypt, then Egypt itself was in pain. But while the public mourned, the political machine was working furiously behind the scenes. Because 70 days is a long time. And in ancient Egypt, as in every civilization throughout history, a power vacuum, even a symbolic one, attracted danger like blood attracts crocodiles. Rivals had to be managed. Priests had to be aligned. Officials who had been loyal to the old pharaoh needed to declare loyalty to the new one. Foreign powers who had been held in check by the dead king's reputation needed to be reminded that the new king was equally formidable. Diplomacy did not pause for mourning. Historian Bob Breyer, who has written extensively on Egyptian royal deaths and mummies, has pointed out that many of the military campaigns launched in the early years of a new pharaoh's reign were specifically designed to project strength to foreign nations who might interpret the transition as weakness. The death of a king was an invitation to test borders. The new king's first job, sometimes before the old king was even fully mummified, was to make clear that Egypt had not flinched. Meanwhile, construction was already underway, or had been for years. Here is something that reframes everything you think you know about Egyptian pyramids and tombs. Most pharaohs began building their tombs almost immediately after taking the throne, not because they were morbid, but because they understood that the quality of your afterlife depended entirely on the quality of your preparation. The tomb was not a place you built when you got old. It was a project you maintained for your entire reign. When a pharaoh died, his successor inherited that half-finished or fully finished monument and had a direct obligation, both religious and political, to see it completed and properly stocked. Leaving a predecessor's tomb unfinished was not just disrespectful, it was dangerous. An improperly housed royal ka could become a source of chaos. A wandering divine soul was no one's ally. The new pharaoh's first acts of piety were almost always directed at completing what his predecessor had started. And then there was the tomb's contents. The burial goods placed with a pharaoh were not decorative, they were functional. The Egyptians believed the afterlife was a mirror of this life. The pharaoh would need food, clothing, tools, furniture, servants, and protection. Servants were not sacrificed in the dynastic period. That practice, if it existed at all, was abandoned early. Instead, shabtis, small figurines representing workers, were placed in the tomb by the hundreds. Some pharaohs were buried with hundreds of shabtis, one for each day of the year, some with more. The tomb walls were covered in text and imagery from the Book of the Dead and related funerary literature, not as decoration, but as instruction manuals for navigating the underworld. Spells to prevent the heart from testifying against the deceased, spells to transform into different creatures, maps of the underworld's 12 hours of night, passwords to get past gatekeepers. The pharaoh was not just buried, he was equipped. The funeral itself, held at the end of the 70 days, was the largest public event in ancient Egyptian life. The mummified body, enclosed in its nested coffins, was transported by boat across the Nile to the West Bank. The west, where the sun set, was the direction of death and the afterlife. The east, where the sun rose, was the direction of life and rebirth. Everything in the burial was oriented. Nothing was accidental. At the entrance to the tomb, priests performed the opening of the mouth ceremony. This was perhaps the most critical ritual in the entire funerary sequence. Using a special instrument, an adze, a priest touched the mummy's mouth, eyes, nose, and ears. The gesture was meant to restore the senses to the dead pharaoh, to make him capable of receiving offerings, to activate him. Without this ceremony, the mummy was an inert shell. With it, the ka could inhabit the body and begin its eternal existence. Then the tomb was sealed, and Egypt moved on. The new pharaoh was crowned in an elaborate ceremony at the capital. He assumed the 5 royal names, a practice documented by scholar James P. Allen in his studies of Egyptian kingship texts, each name representing a different aspect of the divine role he now held. He was Horus, he was the 2 ladies, he was the golden Horus, he was the king of Upper and Lower Egypt, he was the son of Ra, he was the new anchor of Ma'at, and the cycle that had run for 3,000 years continued. Tonight, when you read about ancient Egypt, you will probably read about the monuments, the gold, the grandeur. But what you are actually looking at is a civilization so terrified of the gap, the brief, dangerous moment between one god king and the next, that it built the largest structures in human history just to make sure that gap closed properly. Every pyramid, every tomb, every mummified body is evidence of a society that understood something you still feel today, even if you have no word for it. The moment the most powerful thing in your world disappears, you realize how much of your stability depended on it being there. Egypt built in stone so that absence would never last long. Thank you for watching to the end. Comment Pharaoh if you made it this far. Please don't forget to comment, like, and subscribe. Click here or here for more videos.